Thank you very much. And Jai Bhim, I think it's a very special and important day, in as much as it is a day for thinking about where are we today as a nation and what is happening to us. This is a nation that a generation built with great hope and a dream. Dr. Ambedkar always had a very ambiguous relationship to the idea of India as it was conceived during his lifetime. He was no less a lover of his people, but he felt that the way the Indian nation was being born left much to be desired. And I think his criticism of the Indian nation state is more relevant than ever today. And his own contribution to making it a more democratic, republican, livable country is, of course, very central to all the struggles that many of us are waging to make wherever we are living a better world. So I think the next two lectures, which are really about nationalism and Brahmanism, and for many in the anti-caste movement, beginning from Phule, Periyar, Ayotitas, and many others in northern India, including the Adharmis, the Adi Hindu movement, and of course Ambedkar himself, there was a very important relationship between Brahmanism and nationalism. So this is what is going to be the subject of my next two lectures, today and on Thursday. And as I said, very apt to be talking about it now, in view of how very easily a country can slide into authoritarianism, into a rule of a single party or a single individual without any brakes placed on the extent and the nature of that rule. And this is a crisis that is not only particular to India. It's also a crisis that we see across the world. And in this time of Corona, one of the most important things that all of us are facing is what is our nation state doing for each one of us. And we see a crisis in the United Kingdom, you see a crisis in the United States of America, you see a crisis in Brazil, you see a crisis in Russia. So across the world, there is a sense that the form of the nation state as it has emerged from the 19th century and which has been with us throughout the 20th century is something that we want to address critically and ask questions about. So in that sense also, I think talking about Ambedkar's own understanding of nationalism becomes a very useful, relevant, and important exercise. So that's by way of a very general note on what I wish to say. Coming back to the topic of today and Thursday, I just want to start by connecting it to whatever we've been speaking of and discussing over the last 4 lectures. One is, of course, I want to start with Brahmanism. Now, what is Brahmanism? How do we understand Brahmanism? It's a very important concern and question for Baba Sahib Dr. Ambedkar and for almost the entire spectrum of thinkers and activists in anti-caste movements. So that is something that I shall be looking at some length today and indicate its relationship to nationalism. And I will take up this relationship and nationalism on Thursday's lecture. So to start with, for Dr. Ambedkar, to put it very simply, elegantly, as he always did, Brahmanism is a worldview, an ideology, an outlook which is the enemy of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So this is his most sort of tight, terse description of Brahmanism. Having said that, of course, he would expect us to connect it with various other descriptions that he has provided in his other writings. So therefore, when we say Brahmanism is the enemy of liberty, equality, and fraternity, we also know that it's something that was created to justify what now we call birth-based inequality. Now, of course, the point is there can be no inequality on the basis of birth. As Ambedkar points out, the impression was created that we are each of us different in terms of being better or worse at the moment of our birth. And this was what was created by the priestly class of Brahmins. And we looked at this in the very second lecture when we spoke of caste in India, where Dr. Ambedkar speaks of how this was brought to be, how this was put in place through the creation of what he called an enclosure, wherein varnas, which had very flexible relationships between each other, became enclosed classes through the institution of the principle of endogamy. So the heart of Brahmanism therefore lies in this notion of an enclosure, or what Baba Sahib also sometimes called fortification. We build these forts around us so that we cannot interact with each other freely, happily, openly, creatively, and so on. And this works in the most intimate spheres of our lives, in the realm of marriage, in the realm of love, and so on. So this is something that we know from his earlier writings. But this also then leads to a situation where nobody is equal to anybody else. And this is what he called graded inequality. So Brahmanism is also something that sustains and keeps in place graded inequality. So that is also something that he wants us to understand. The third thing is the effects of Brahmanism. While, of course, the effects of Brahmanism are felt more strongly by those placed at the lowest rung of the caste order, but also those who are placed outside of it, like the so-called untouchables. So he wanted us to know that as well. But importantly, as he points out in his essays on untouchability, which we have looked at, and in Annihilation of Caste, that Brahmanism is something that has created an ugly, unequal, ethically indifferent society. And it actually is something that tells you something about the caste Hindu mind, as he calls it, or what he calls the caste Hindu mental habitude, the mental habits that caste Hindus have developed over a period of time in the shadow of Brahmanism. So he therefore puts the searchlight on the caste Hindu, on Brahmins, and says, look at the social order you've created. Look at the testimony to this idea called Brahmanism, which is why he keeps on telling us that Brahmanism is a notion, it's an attitude. He doesn't mean that this is therefore something that is less important, or that it is only something in people's heads. He wants us to understand that this informs everything that we do. It shapes our attitudes, shapes our relationship to each other. It makes us what we are in terms of this or that person within the caste system. So he's giving it a certain weight, a certain resonance, though he uses the word notion or attitude. So the caste order and Brahmanism are therefore very closely linked in Baba Sahib's understanding. Now, for us, the important question to ask at this juncture is, all these things that Brahmanism has created, these are the effects of Brahmanism, whether it's inequality, whether it's untouchability, whether it's endogamy, which is a means to achieve Brahmanism, enclosure, a means to sustain Brahmanism, graded inequality, the very form of Brahmanism, untouchability, the ugliest expression of Brahmanism. But what is Brahmanism? One definition is, of course, it's the opponent of liberty, equality, fraternity. But Ambedkar went on to give us a far more subtle, complex description and critique of Brahmanism. As we've seen in this class, any description, any critique is not simply a philosophical or political argument. It is advanced with the idea of ending that object of critique, whether it's caste or whether it's Brahmanism. And Ambedkar, the manner he defined Brahmanism, the conceptual importance he accorded it, it's something that we can sort of pick up from an essay from a talk that he gave in 1938 to railway workers at Manmad, where he speaks of how for the working class, both Brahmanism and capitalism are inveterate enemies, that they have to fight both Brahmanism and capitalism. So he gives it the sort of centrality that communists, who are the others that are interested in a wholesale social transformation, want to sort of give capitalism. So Ambedkar feels you cannot fight capitalism in the Indian context without actually fighting Brahmanism. So that's the sort of conceptual importance that he gives Brahmanism in his own understanding of it. So what is Brahmanism then? How does one understand it? And here I think Ambedkar is fairly clear that Brahmanism has to do with the worldviews outlined and kept in place by the priestly class. And this is very important because he doesn't think it's the worldview of individuals. He doesn't think that any one individual created it. We saw this when we looked at the triumph of Brahmanism, and we saw it when we looked at annihilation of caste and caste in India, that it's neither the individual called Manu, whoever he was, or any particular Brahmin intellectual who can be credited with having created this ideology, this worldview called Brahmanism. But Brahmanism instead is the ideology of a particular class of people whom Ambedkar designates as the priestly class as they emerged in ancient India. And this ideology is meant to preserve and sustain their interests. So in that sense, it's like any class ideology which is closely tied to the sustaining and maintenance of power and authority of a ruling combine. How do we understand that ruling combine? Is the priestly class the sole ruling combine in the Indian context? How does the priestly class exercise authority? It does so in a religious sense. It does so in a social and cultural sense. How does it do it in a socio-economic sense, in a political sense? So any consideration of Brahmanism for Ambedkar then has to answer all these questions as well. And here it's important to remember when Ambedkar says that Brahmanism is something that is a creation of the priestly class and it serves the priestly class, that he understood this class as something that is part of what he considered the heterogeneous, the racially and culturally heterogeneous population of India. And this is what made his understanding different from, say, that of Mahatma Phule or Ayodhya or many others who saw the priestly class as having come from outside the so-called boundaries of the subcontinent, that they came in from Central Asia. Now, this is an argument that the right wing also shares. If you read the argument, if you read the writings of Tilak, for example, you will sort of see that he spends a lot of time thinking about the original home of the Aryans. And he places it somewhere in the Arctic Circle. So that sense of the Brahmins being outsiders is something that both the critics of the caste system as well as the defenders of the caste system advanced in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. But for Ambedkar, that was not a very important question. While he considered that there must have been what he considered indigenous populations, like, and he would call them the Nagas later on in his Buddhist writings, he did not think that the Brahmins as the class, as a priestly class, as they had emerged in India, were entirely comprised of outsiders. Yes, of course, there were many migrations into the subcontinent, but he did not think of the Brahmins as having emerged only out of that population. Indian populations are heterogeneous and the priestly class emerged out of this heterogeneous combine. So that is one difference that we need to keep in mind. The second thing is, of course, that this priestly class acquired power over a period of time. So why is it important for Ambedkar to say that? Because the priestly class is not born. And this is a point he wants us to understand. And this is a point the priestly class argues about itself, that it is created that way. And as we all know, that famous hymn from the Purusha Sukta, where it is claimed that the Brahmins were born from the head of the Godhead. So this, to work against this idea of the priestly class as being endowed with that quality and that function in nature itself, is something that Ambedkar refutes very strongly. Therefore, he explains to us how this came to be in the Triumph of Brahmanism and many other essays. Basically, he wants us to understand that over a period of time, Brahmanical thinkers evolved this idea of the priestly class as having emerged from the Godhead, from the head of Brihaspati, sorry, not Brihaspati, of the Supreme Creator. So this is something Ambedkar does not accept. This class emerged in the course of history, and that history we saw a little bit in the Triumph of Brahmanism. He also points out that this history was not simply a question of the priestly class imposing its will on all other classes. This was a history of contestation and struggle. And in fact, Dr. Ambedkar points out in another essay that I had asked you to read earlier, Philosophy of Hinduism, that ancient India knew class struggle. And this was a struggle between Brahmins and Kshatriyas, amongst the Kshatriyas, and between the Brahmins and Kshatriyas on the one hand, and the Shudras and Vaishyas on the other. So basically, he wants us to see the power and authority of the Brahmins as emerging from a very complex, contested history of struggles. And why is this important for him? Just so to indicate that it is only a certain combination of power and authority that made it possible for Brahmins as a class to sustain their leadership in the realm of culture and religion. And what is this association? What is this combination that today we would call the ruling class or the ruling combination? So Ambedkar points out both in the triumph of Brahmanism and in who were the Shudras, how this came to be. And he points to how this happens at two levels: at the level of society, where initially, after quarreling amongst themselves, the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, they agreed to combine together against the Vaishyas and the Shudras. So here you see a class struggle where the ruling combine of priests and warriors sets itself against the producing combine of the Vaishyas and the Shudras. So this is definitely a class relationship in the Marxist sense as well, that those who control political power through the sword and those who have given to themselves the right to hold power in the realm of religion and in the realm of culture, they come together against the producing classes, those who create wealth, which are the classes, the old varnas of the Vaishyas and Shudras. So this is the mechanism through which Brahmanism sustains its ideological strength, not on its own merits, but in combination with the power extended to the rule of the priestly class in the realms of religion by the Kshatriyas. And as Ambedkar will explain in what Gandhi and Congress did to the untouchables, in the present day, the power of the Kshatriyas has been replaced by the Banya, by the capitalist class, which is why he asked for the working class to set itself against Brahmanism and capitalism. So this is the sort of logic of the ruling class that Ambedkar wants us to notice. Why do I call it a logic? It is a historical development, but historians might differ on how this development took place. How did this happen? When did the Brahmins and Kshatriyas come together? Were not the Kshatriyas opposed to the Brahmins during the time of the Buddha? Did not the Kshatriyas set themselves against Brahmins in the time of Shivaji in Western India? Did not the Kshatriyas not exist in a place like, say, southern India, where you had only Shudra rulers who had to then take on Kshatriya status? So see, these are questions that historians have asked. Now, we are not getting into those arguments, but I think those questions do not actually disturb the logic that Ambedkar puts in place, which is that the power exerted by Brahmanism is always dependent on the existence of a ruling combine comprising the Brahmins and another class which exercises decisive political power. And through the exercise of decisive political power, which is also economic power in the modern period, Brahmanism sustains itself. So this is a second argument. Brahmanism as a product of the priestly class is the first argument, that it sustains itself in and through a ruling combine is the second argument. And this ruling combine can be different at different points in history, but it is entirely necessary for Brahmanism to exert its authority. And this is a second argument. The third argument is, now what is this thing that Brahmanism does to convince the Kshatriyas and anybody else who is part of the ruling combine to agree to itself, to agree to its premises? This is a question also that Ambedkar asks, and here he makes it clear this is not because of anything special that Brahmins as a class have produced by way of superior thought or by way of a superior social system, but it is through other means that this has been achieved. And he's very, very clear that we have to understand this, that Brahmins did not produce a superior system of thought through which they convinced those others in the social combine to accept their worldview. Why is it important for Ambedkar to say it, and how does he say it? It's important for him to say it because one of the arguments in his own time, and an argument which continues in our time also,
is that if Brahmins are where they are today as a class, that's because of something ineffable that they have which others don't have. And today we call it merit within quotes. We say that it's the meritorious that achieve social power, social authority. In the past, it was considered that they had something special which helped them access the greatest form of all knowledges, which is spiritual knowledge. And the late Professor Ram Bapat from Pune used to say that it is not that Brahmins denied knowledge to all other classes in a sort of singular kind of way. They made sure that certain knowledges were available so that society can continue. The knowledge of the artisan, the knowledge of the agriculturalist, the knowledge of the merchant, these things should continue. Without such knowledge forms, society cannot sustain itself. But what the Brahmins very clearly said was, while you can continue to weigh and measure, while you can continue to sort of improve on agricultural practices, such knowledges will never be given the status of true knowledge. True knowledge is only the knowledge of Brahman. True knowledge is only the knowledge of what the gods have to say to us, of the scripture. And that knowledge, the Brahmins as a class refuse to share with anyone else. And this is one of the means through which they kept themselves in positions of power and authority. And this is one of the reasons why the other constituents of the ruling combine, whether it's the Kshatriyas or whether it's the Banyas, need the Brahmin, because they need the affirmation of their own political power through spiritual means. And we all know from Shivaji's history how he had to get some Brahmins from Banaras to say and to affirm his claims to being a Kshatriya. And we also know that all the kings of the Chola kingdom in the south, none of whom could claim Kshatriya status, required the Brahmin to pronounce that status. So that for Ambedkar is the secret of the relationship between the ruling mind and the power of Brahmanism. So each needs the other in a very important sense, but with this caveat that the power of the Brahmin still remains very important, because that power is based on a knowledge system which the Brahmins claim others cannot access, including the Kshatriyas at some point. Because Ambedkar also points out in the Triumph of Brahmanism how at one point anyone could access this knowledge. So you had a Gurukul system where the Rishi or the Guru would take on students from the Kshatriyas and take on students even from the Shudra classes and invest them with the sacred thread. But then he tells you that investing with the sacred thread, which is like a kind of graduation certificate, then becomes a sort of private familial ritual. So the guru ceases to be important and the father becomes important. So it's the father who will invest the son with the sacred thread. So what used to be a class ritual or a ritual that has to do with the creation of an educated person becomes a family ritual. This is something he argues in Triumph of Brahmanism and also in Who Were the Shudras. So the denial of the sacred thread to the Shudras is a mark of their degradation. So basically what Ambedkar wants us to see is that you might have political power and you of course have economic power, but you need the affirmation of either kinds of power by the power of the Brahmin class, which holds the sole rights to spiritual power. Now, as far as the other castes are concerned, the other classes are concerned, the withholding of this power has been a very important part of the creation of the system of graded inequality. So the refusal of knowledge. Now, what does the refusal of this knowledge mean? As I said, quoting Ram Bapat, that this is not that all kinds of knowledge are refused. It is spiritual knowledge that is refused. And in the Indian context, spiritual knowledge is not simply philosophic knowledge. It is also the right to understand how the society has been created, how this society is to be kept in place. So Ambedkar makes it very clear in all his writings on religion that the knowledge that religious systems produce is fundamentally a knowledge about the relationship of human beings to each other on the one hand, and the relationship of human beings to God on the other. And in the Indian context, in the Hindu context, both kinds of knowledges, the relationship between human beings and God, and the relationship between human beings, themselves are controlled by the Brahmanical class, because they had reserved for themselves the right to understand both kinds of knowledge. And they have created these knowledge systems on their own. In today's context, if you were to use the language of social media, for example, they are the ones who historically have controlled the narrative. They have controlled the way the story of religion is to be told. They have controlled the terms of the storytelling. So Ambedkar points out, especially in riddles in Hinduism, for example, how did this come to be? How did they control these stories? How did they make themselves the most important players in this universe of ideas? So this is something that he points to, which is why he refuses to concede to them the status of intellectuals or philosophers. Now, in his own lifetime, there was a great deal of interest in ancient Hindu thought, especially the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and so on, which were considered very important philosophic texts. Now, Ambedkar refused to accept that these philosophic texts were sort of evolved by the Brahmins on their own. Why does he say that? While he concedes in some of his arguments that the whole idea of Brahmaism, not Brahmanism, but Brahmaism, which is the idea of a supreme principle which unites all of us, irrespective of our birth and irrespective of whether we are human, that we are each of us part of this supreme principle, which could be called the Brahma principle. He says that is a very noble idea. And in his early writings, he says, I cannot understand how a society that has evolved this idea can tolerate the kind of cruel practices that you have in the social realm, the inequalities which are sustained in the social realm. So in his early writings, he says, there is something about the idea of Brahmaism which is very important. But in his later writings, especially when you come to revolution and counter-revolution in ancient India, or when you come to Krishna and his Gita, you see him sort of saying, even this idea of Brahmaism, even this idea of, say, the Upanishads, which also talk about this Brahmaism, he says he's not very sure that these are original ideas. These are ideas, he would argue, which the Brahmins picked up from the Buddha. That these are things that they thought through and they evolved, taking ideas on loan from Buddhism and making it part of their philosophical systems. So he refused to concede that Brahmins as a class had evolved anything original even by way of philosophic ideas. And I think this was an important argument for him, because he felt that while philosophy is not something that happens only in one's head, it is very intimately related to a social system. This is also something we know from Marx. He wanted us to also understand that the philosophical systems of India have always reflected the divisions of the social order, which means then that the philosophical ideas that emerged in ancient India cannot be thought of outside of the system of inequality, which is caste. And if the Brahmins have developed certain philosophical ideas, they must bear the imprint of caste. Otherwise, we cannot understand how they actually functioned. So if you have a superior philosophical idea, it was made immaterial, right? So you can have the idea of Brahmaism, but it has no consequence. You can pay lip service to that idea and continue to be cruel in everyday life. So this is the paradox Ambedkar wanted us to understand, which is why he wanted us to see the philosophic ideas of the Brahmins as being irrelevant to everyday practice on the one hand, and as something that they created because they wanted to hold their own against the very powerful teachings of the Buddha. So these are two ideas that he wanted us to understand. And at one point he says, I will even refuse to them the appellation of being an intellectual class. So that is what they consider themselves to be. But he said that they cannot even be considered an intellectual class. At the most, you can call them an educated class. And this differentiation is very important for us to understand, because in Ambedkar's view of the intellectual, he had a very positive view of the intellectual. He felt that the intellectual must have the ability to think, to reflect, to reason along with society. And the intellectual's ideas are always made available to society. The intellectual never says, I have said this, you have to follow what I say. As he says in the essay that I wanted you to read for this class, Ranade, Gandhi and Jinnah, that the intellectual is somebody who persuades others to think, who wants others to think. And here Ambedkar's ideas of the intellectual is perhaps closest to that of Antonio Gramsci, who also saw the intellectuals as not simply those who are educated or learned, but that each one of us can be an intellectual. And together, as we intellectualize and form a collective, for Gramsci, that collective was the Communist Party. The intellectuals and the workers and everyone coming together would permanently persuade people to build a better society. This is Gramsci's argument. Ambedkar's argument is not dissimilar. He argues that the philosophical function of thought, of thinking, of being an intellectual is something that all of us can do. So it's a very democratic activity as far as he's concerned. Therefore, he was very committed to showing us that the Brahmanical class cannot be intellectual. It's illogical to expect them to be intellectual. They could only be an educated class. And as an educated class, they controlled education till the modern period, when it was no longer possible for them to sort of exercise that control. So that's the third point he makes about Brahmanism, that it is not a worldview which is based on a sound and consistent philosophic system. It is an argument that has emerged out of historical contestations to support a ruling combine. And the Brahmanical philosophical system owes a great deal to the philosophical arguments evolved by the Buddha. And this is something that he argues most forcefully in that very classic text, unfinished text, a tantalizing text, which is Krishna and his Gita, which I think is a very important text for Ambedkar, which he sadly never completed. And this text is something that is important, for, at least in my understanding, for two reasons. It is not that Ambedkar's arguments about the Gita borrowing ideas from the Buddha are particularly his own. These ideas were part of the milieu that he was writing in. And as I said in an earlier essay, these ideas were put forth by Dharmananda Kosambi, amongst others, by K.P. Jaiswal, by a whole host of historians. But Ambedkar does something very important with that argument, that the ideas expounded in the Bhagavad Gita are sort of reflect the ideas of the Buddha, because Ambedkar does a close textual reading of the Bhagavad Gita. And he points out, what does Krishna, the purported author of the Bhagavad Gita, do with these Buddhist arguments? And he picks up the four important words or concepts that are central to the Dhamma of the Buddha. And many of us know this: Karuna, Maitri, Mudita, and Upeksha. So these are very important words in the Buddhist lexicon. And Ambedkar points out very astutely that these words are words that point to how the Buddha or how the upholders of the Dhamma expected us to relate to each other. So Karuna is a relationship of compassion. Maitri is a relationship in social fellowship. Mudita is sympathetic joy. And Upeksha is something that we sort of acquire together as a group of people. Now for Ambedkar, these values, which have to do with the nature of relationships, with the nature of social relationships, have a very different meaning in the Gita, because they all become attributes of the ideal devotee, of the Bhakt. So when Krishna in the Gita says, whether you follow the Jnana Marg or the Karma Marg or any of these other margs that he speaks of in the Bhagavad Gita, the most important thing he says is that you can count on me as the Paramatma to grant you all salvation. If you come to me, if you are devoted to me, then whatever you do is not as material as you think it is. Your salvation, your happiness rests on my benediction, my affection for you. I, as a creator, have these great protective impulses towards you, and by that you will earn your freedom and salvation. I'm sort of summarizing Ambedkar's arguments. So Ambedkar says, by making this move, the author of the Bhagavad Gita, whom he thinks is a Brahmanical philosopher, displaces the important relational values that are expounded in the Buddha, in the Dhamma, into a universe where we all agree to suspend our thought, suspend our relationship to each other, which has to be mindful, and surrender ourselves to the Paramatma. And this, he thinks, is one of the most important achievements of the Gita, the concept of the Paramatma. And the concept of the Paramatma, what it does is, it sets in motion a way of thinking wherein the most unfortunate, the most oppressed, the most exploited turn to devotionalism, turn to bhakti. So it is bhakti which then offers you some kind of a compensation for what you can't have in real life. To Ambedkar, this is a serious problem. And this is why he always felt, much as he valued the bhakti tradition, he had great respect for Tukaram, he had great respect for Kabir. But much as you valued that tradition, he didn't think that one could acquire a sense of well-being, salvation, self-respect, equality, justice, by being part of that tradition. So he was at pains for us to understand why we must read the Krishna and his Gita as a gospel of the counter-revolution against Buddhism, and how we must read it along with the Manu Smriti. I spoke about this earlier, but so I won't spend too much time on it. But I think what's very important for us to notice at this point is that where the Bhagavad Gita offers the possibility of redemption through devotion, the Manu Smriti does the opposite. It points out that if you dare to do something that you ought not to do, which is that if you dare to transgress the codes of the Varna order, then you will be subject to a series of punishments. And the Manusmriti and all the law digests that emerged thereafter, Ambedkar argues, that they prescribe, first of all, a graded set of virtues, a graded set of religious principles, a graded set of religious practices, through which they affirm the principle of graded inequality. So if you're a Brahmin, you will have Vedic rituals. If you are not a Brahmin, you can only have Puranic rituals, and so on and so forth. So basically, by this graded system and by a system of punishment, the Manusmriti makes it clear that you cannot hope to sort of cross the limits set by the social system. Now, whether the Manusmriti actually involved any actual jurisprudence is something we can leave to the historians. But as Ambedkar often points out, it is not simply the law which sort of legislates what is right and wrong. It is also the force of social morality. And the spirit of Manu, for him, has been upheld throughout different kinds of historical periods and through different social formations, because that is the spirit of the Indian ruling combines. So that spirit may actualize itself in different ways, but it wants us all to adhere to the system of graded inequality and untouchability. So therefore, Brahmanism comprises in having given to us on the one hand devotional bhakti, and on the other hand Manusmriti, which is a system of tedious and oppressive rules. So Ambedkar therefore says, if Brahmanism has kept itself alive, it is through these means. But he wants us to notice it as relevant in one more very important fashion. And this brings me to the last part of my lecture today, which is a book that he never wrote, a section of a book that he never wrote, which was meant to be part of revolution and counter-revolution. And we only have a very tantalizing title to a chapter. And this is there at the end of the volume, Revolution and Counter-Revolution. And the chapter is titled, as I said very tantalizingly, The Present Age is the Age of Counter-Revolution. Why does Ambedkar consider the present age the age of counter-revolution? What is the revolution of the present? Now, for Ambedkar, the present age was not simply the 20th century in which he spent much of his life, but it was the age of democracy and modernity, which he traces back to the French Revolution, in some cases to the English Revolution of the 17th century, in some other cases to the American Revolution, in some ways to the Russian Revolution. But basically, it is the age of democracy and modernity, where each one of us is seen as being a universal subject of history, capable of ruling ourselves, capable of thinking through things, and each of us is completely entitled to liberty, equality, and fraternity. So this is the modern revolution. Now, this revolution, Ambedkar wanted perhaps to argue, is already being challenged by a counter-revolution. Now, what is that counter-revolution in the Indian context? As I said, these phrases are not so important, revolution and counter-revolution, because they're not something that only Ambedkar spoke of. Historians of his time spoke of it. And Ambedkar, as a student of the French Revolution, knew that these were terms used by historians of the French Revolution. But this set of terms becomes very important to him because he thinks that a counter-revolution is happening in front of our eyes. And what is that counter-revolution? In the Indian context for Ambedkar, that is Gandhism. Gandhism is something that we spoke of in the last class. Now, the question that we need to ask at this point, did Ambedkar identify Gandhism with Brahmanism? Gandhi himself, of course, was not a Brahmin, but we know of Gandhi's views on Varnashrama Dharma. We know that he opposed untouchability, saying there was no sanction in the sacred text, but he felt that Varnashrama Dharma, however he chose to define it, was an ideal that Hindu society would do well to support and endorse. Now, Ambedkar felt that Gandhism combined in itself both the idea of a Mahatma to whom you could look to for direction, for how to run your life. It also had features of, say, the law digest of ancient India, though Gandhi himself was not a lawgiver, because it insisted on upholding Varnashrama Dharma. So, in a sense, Gandhi as Mahatma had something for everybody. He had something for the masses, which is that he said, you emulate me, you look at me, you can also be Mahatmas. But he basically created a culture of adulation, according to Ambedkar. But he also allowed the Congress right wing to feel good about its own mental habitude, which was shaped by Manu, Smriti. So basically for Ambedkar, Gandhism was the gospel of the counter-revolution. And this is something that he explores in two essays. One of them I've asked you to read, which is Ranade, Gandhi and Jinnah. The other is an earlier essay called Federation versus Freedom, where Ambedkar compares the age of Ranade to the age of Gandhi. And he says, the age of Ranade, which is the early modern period in Indian history in the early 19th century, is when even Brahmins like Ranade used their minds, were committed to reflective thought, could reason their way into things, and who understood the importance of knowledge for the thinking of what the present should be, of what the shape of our society should be. To him, this was the very opposite of how Gandhi and Jinnah were conducting themselves, which is that they had become these very charismatic leader figures to whom they wanted everyone to surrender themselves to. So for him, Gandhism had secured for a certain sort of nationalism the consensus that it desired, the consensus that it required. So Gandhism was a form of consensus, much like the Bhagavad Gita was a certain form of consensus, through which an emergent Indian nationalism won support from very diverse sections of society. So this is an argument he makes in Ranade, Gandhi and Jinnah, which I think is a very, very important essay. And what this consensus was is, of course, we will see in the next class, but I just want to point to certain things here about the sort of nationalism for which Gandhism was producing a kind of consensus. Now, this nationalism is not necessarily linked to only Gandhi's vision of the nation, which I still think is different from the vision of the nation that various segments within the Congress had for it. This vision of the nation that has come to be, this vision of the nation that subsequently emerged and has consolidated itself over the centuries, is a vision of the nation that was anchored in the notion that India is ultimately a Hindu nation. While there were those who did not subscribe to it, amongst them Nehru, Gandhi himself did not think India could only be a Hindu nation. But ultimately, it was the vision of a number of people who held this idea that India was a Hindu nation, and who might then go on to tell you by Hindu they don't mean a religion, but a civilization, to which Gandhi himself lent his support. But the idea that civilizationally India is a Hindu nation, that to some religiously also it was a Hindu nation, is something that has come to stay with us. In Ambedkar's own lifetime, that was something that was sort of argued most vociferously by the Hindu right wing, by amongst others Savarkar. And we must remember that some of Ambedkar's harshest criticisms are reserved for Savarkar in Pakistan or the partition of India. And Ambedkar's harshest criticisms, even in his early youth, were reserved for the Hindu Mahasabha. And this is something we mustn't forget. In the midst of all the attempts to appropriate Ambedkar's writings to a Hindu nationalist purpose, it's important for us to understand that he criticized Hindu nationalism in no uncertain words. But he also criticized the tendency to think of the term Hindu in civilizational terms. And he was equally opposed to that. And he felt that if we are to think of a civilizational basis for this nation that we are trying to create, that civilizational basis has to draw its strength from Buddhism on the one hand. This is what he would argue in his later days, but more fundamentally from the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Of course, later on he would say these are principles that Buddha himself stood for. Now, historians might agree or not agree with that, but basically, for Ambedkar, the kind of nation that was emerging was completely problematic. It was internally inconsistent. It did not seek to address the question of graded inequality and untouchability. And most importantly, it could very well turn out to be a Hindu majority nation. And Ambedkar wanted to complicate that argument. He refused to concede the possibility of a Hindu nationalism. He refused to accept that Hindu could be a term that had civilizational significance. If at all we wanted a civilizational basis for this nation, he would rather that we turn to Buddhism. So this is also why he sort of wanted us to view perhaps Gandhism as a gospel of the counter-revolution in the present. Gandhism shares certain features of Brahmanism, and for this reason, Ambedkar was committed to opposing it all his life. So I will end with that, and we will pick up the story as a story of nationalism as it emerged in the early 20th century in my class on Thursday. Thank you.